Friends, in this new segment, we are going to today talk about multiculturalism. Now, a discussion on multiculturalism becomes imperative once we start talking about the issue of culture in global politics. Now, till a few decades back, if somebody was talking about culture in relation to international politics and relations, people would have been surprised. What has culture to do with global politics? But today, culture is a very important constituent to understand how global politics operates and how relations among countries are conditioned. In our discussion on culture, it's important for us to understand this phenomena of multiculturalism in global politics. Primarily, the multicultural movement started in Canada in the early 1970s, and then it slowly spread to other countries, Australia and other countries of the global north. Multiculturalism basically describes a society where different cultures live together and side by side. It is simple actuality of cultural diversity. In a multicultural society, there is no official culture that every person is required to be a part of. Now, in this globalized world, the globalized culture itself is multicultural. So while globalization developed primarily in the West, it had many influences from the non-West as well. Actually, the liberal idea of the West incorporated a certain degree of multiculturalism. Therefore, it is important for us to look at the meaning and the dimensions of multiculturalism and also to talk about the challenges which it faces in the world of today. Multiculturalism is a way of looking at human life. It starts with the understanding that human beings are culturally embedded, culturally rooted, and they lead their lives in a culturally configured world. Human beings conduct their social relations in the frame of a culturally derived system. So it is not that the culture determines them, and they do not look at it critically, but they are basically profoundly shaped by that culture. It could be sometimes the culture, or most of the times, it is the culture in which people are born, But sometimes some people could adopt some other culture or decide to adopt some other culture once they change their location, Somebody moving out from India and living there in America or some other country of the West might decide to adopt that culture. Moreover, one's life tends to get richer and better if one comes across and comes into contact with other cultures. It enlarges one's boundaries of culture. And otherwise, it is also not possible to escape the effects of other cultures in this modern globalized world. So the assumption is that no culture is complete by itself, No culture is perfect in itself. So you need other cultures to add value to the existing culture, which you are shaped in, which you are rooted in. And that other culture is not polluting or contaminating your culture, rather it makes it richer and better. So that is the basic assumption behind multiculturalism. However, all cultures have their uniqueness. No culture is good or bad. Quite often, a lot of people would try to look derisively at certain cultures because the practices in those cultures are not consistent with their own cultures. But the question of good or bad in relation to culture is not the right question, because for all people, their own culture is good. So if you are living in some country and some place of the world, your culture is good for you and my culture is good for me. Because any culture, as I mentioned earlier, is not perfect and therefore should not be imposed on others. So the very idea that cultural imposition is wrong, within that idea is the inherent idea that no culture is perfect. Since any culture is not perfect, it is not proper and right to impose that culture on others. We all need to learn from other cultures. And any cultural change should come from inside, from within. It should never be imposed from above. Every culture has a plural identity. It is fluid and it grows with the process of socialization in a society. That is the process through which people learn about their culture, and that is the process through which the culture is transmitted from one generation to the other. And in this process of generational transfer of culture, the growth of culture also takes place, and certain new things, certain new ideas, certain new practices keep on getting added to that culture, and certain things slowly and gradually go out of practice. So therefore it is fluid and dynamic, it is constantly evolving. And in the path of its growth and progression, every culture picks up elements from other cultures, and they slowly and gradually get imbibed in that culture, and most of the times it is inadvertent. And therefore, it eventually goes on making every culture multicultural in a variety of ways. So over time, with the passage of time, all cultures have elements of multiculturalism in them. A culture cannot appreciate the value of others unless it understands the plurality within it. And the opposite is just as true. So, a multicultural perspective takes into account all these factors. It takes cognizance of the fact that all human beings are culturally rooted, and cultural plurality is unavoidable, inescapable, and all cultures are essentially multicultural. Although the content of that imbibing of the other cultures, the percentage might vary from one culture to the other, but to assume that any culture would be rather exclusive in the sense that it would not have influences of any other culture is like living in a fool's paradise. So, looking from a multicultural standpoint, no political canon can epitomize the complete truth of human life. Each of them, any political idea, any political value, like for example liberalism or socialism, they are all rooted in a particular culture, and they represent a specific vision of good life, and therefore they are unavoidably or inescapably narrow and limited. From a multicultural perspective, the good society cherishes the diversity of these values and encourages a creative dialogue between different cultures. Such a society not only represents its members' rights to their culture, but rather it increases the range of their choices and also contributes to cultivating their power of self-criticism, and eventually it contributes to their development and well-being. So that is how, multiculturalism or the idea of multiculturalism needs to be understood. And therefore, any multicultural society cannot for long sustain without developing a common sense of belonging among its citizens. The sense of belonging cannot be ethnic and based on shared cultural, ethnic, or other features. For a multicultural society is actually too varied for that. But it must be political and it must be based on a shared obligation to the political group. So, in a multicultural society, the people living there do not directly belong to each other as one would do in an ethnic group, but through their arbitrating association with a shared community. And they are committed to each other because they are all in their own different ways committed to a common historical community. They do actually, and they should, matter to each other because they are all fused together by the bonds of common interest and affection to each other. So that is how, people are linked together and they have that common interest and common bonds in a multicultural society. In a multicultural society, different communities would obviously have different needs. And some might be structurally or anatomically disadvantaged, or they might lack the skills and the confidence to participate in the mainstream society and be able to avail of its opportunities. They could be minority groups, like maybe the Afro-Americans in America or Muslims or Sikhs in India. Both justice or the idea of justice or the value of justice and the need to foster a common sense of belonging require that such actions such as group differentiated rights, culturally differentiated applications of laws and policies, and further state support for minority institutions and programs for affirmative action needs to be weaved in the system to ensure justice and to ensure that these people have that kind of a confidence that they come to acquire with time a common sense of belonging rather than slowly and gradually getting alienated and being pushed to the margins because they would feel that they are not actually required in that system or they are not an equal participant in that system. So, equal citizenship or the sense of equal citizenship or the confidence that we all enjoy equal citizenship is vital to nurture a common logic of belonging among all people. But it is not enough. Citizenship is about status and rights. Belongingness is about acceptance and identification. And these two do not necessarily match. One must enjoy all rights of citizenship, but feel that one does not quite belong to the community and is a relative outsider, as do some sections of Afro-Americans in America. So, along with these rights and status, one needs to have that sense of belonging, sense of acceptance, and sense of identification. And the true test of that is if you were to go and talk to those people who are feeling that sense of marginalization and that sense of non-identification. If those groups and sections of population are satisfied with the level of acceptance and identification, you can say truly that this society is in reality multicultural. This feeling of being fully a citizen and yet an outsider is difficult to explain. And as I mentioned, they can only be understood by those who experience it. But it can be deep, quite deep and real. And it can totally damage and fragment the quality of one's citizenship as well as one's sense of commitment to the political community of which one is supposed to be a member. It is caused by, among other things, the manner in which the wide society, the society at large, defines itself, the condescending ways in which the rest of the members of the society talk about these groups, and the contemptuous ways in which they treat them. So, although the members of these groups are by law free to participate in the public life, they generally stay away because they fear being called out, they fear being looked at in a contemptuous, degrading manner, and they fear being, mocked at. So, therefore, what they would prefer is that they would generally try to keep away and operate on the margins of the system. So, when the dominant culture defines the minorities in a demeaning way and methodically strengthens it by all the institutional and other means which are at the disposal of the majority, they deliberately or involuntarily internalized the negative self-image and lack of self-esteem and alienation from the mainstream society. So this is what happens to minority groups if the dominant culture, tries to define them in that manner. And consequently what happens? That these groups, these minority groups have a certain kind of misrecognition about themselves. And this misrecognition has both a cultural and a factual foundation. For example, the whites in the United States of America, for example, take quite often a very disparaging view of blacks, partly under the influence of racism, and partly also because it helps them justify the existing system of control, and partially because the deeply disadvantaged blacks do sometimes in their exasperation, in their frustration, exhibit certain features, like for example, they might sometimes resort to violence, and these features then eventually go on to confirm the stereotypes about these black people which whites have in their minds. So they, in fact, the reaction sometimes, the violent reaction sometimes goes on to confirm the existing stereotypes in the minds of the white population. So misrecognition can only be contradicted, neutralized by undertaking a very hard critique of the dominant culture and sometimes fundamentally rearranging the dominant inequalities of economic, social and political power, which is disproportionately in the hands of the dominant sections of the society. Now we look at certain challenges, which multiculturalism throws up in practice, when it operates in any society. The political theories, institutions and vocabulary which the Western world has developed in the course of uniting and directing the affairs of culturally homogeneous states during the past few centuries are only a partial help, and sometimes they could also be a potential handicap in dealing with multicultural societies. Because what the Western countries of Europe have done, over the past 3 centuries, that they have been able to institutionalize quite culturally homogeneous nation states. But in the present times, as a consequence of refugees coming in, migrations and other economic needs and globalization in the world, the nature of their societies are changing. And these countries need to find ways of integrating the genuine demands now of unity and diversity, of attaining political unity without insisting on cultural uniformity. And they need to educate their citizens both regarding a common sense of belonging and also a readiness to respect and cherish cultural differences. Because as a consequence of the influx of large number of people in European countries over a long period of time, we find that the composition of their societies have changed drastically, and there are a lot of people coming from non-Western cultures, who are part of those societies, and they are leading to a lot of conflicts, a lot of issues, and maybe demands for monoculturalism in many societies or many countries of Western Europe. So there is a daunting, very challenging theoretical as well as political task, and a challenge for all societies which want and claim that they are multicultural. For example, societies which lacked that imagination and foresight met with disaster, like for example the erstwhile Soviet Union. Even the mature democracies like USA and France and UK, have had only a very limited success, and they have shown signs of strong moral and emotional confusion in the face of increasing minority demands for recognition and equality, and we see all kinds of such confusions in the polities of these countries quite often rising up, too prominently for even people from other countries of the world to notice. So therefore, the results of cultural proximity, when people of different kinds live with each other, in a multicultural setting, the results are quite complex, because multicultural settings, would create multiple identities, and therefore challenge the icons of existing culture, as well as the sections, who are beneficiaries of some of these within them. So these are the new situations, which countries or multicultural societies need to contend with. But multiculturalism has tended to undermine patriarchy. It has given more space to women in these societies, and therefore, there is a kind of competition both at the theoretical level and at the operational level as to how the ideas associated with multiculturalism have to be integrated and imbibed in societies, and how societies need to prepare themselves to meet the challenges of diversity, which are going to be even more prominent and rather serious in the times to come for all these countries, all countries of the world, in the immediate future. Thank you.